You probably used rosemary this week. Maybe you pulled a jar from the back of your spice rack and shook some dried leaves onto a roasting pan without giving it a second thought. Maybe you walked past a rosemary bush in someone's front yard and caught that sharp, piney smell for half a second before it was gone. Either way, you treated it the same way almost everyone treats it. As background, as seasoning, as the herb equivalent of elevator music. Rosemary has been cultivated for over 5,000 years. Ancient civilizations treated it as one of the most important plants on Earth. At least, that was true until about 200 years ago. That was when rosemary slipped from sacred to ordinary. From something you placed in the hands of the dead, to something you shook out of a plastic bottle onto a chicken breast. So how did the same herb end up in Egyptian tombs and your grocery store checkout aisle? This story doesn't start in a kitchen. It starts on a cliff. Rosemary is native to the rocky coastline of the Mediterranean, the kind of terrain where most plants would just give up. Salt spray, thin soil, drought that lasts months. And yet rosemary thrived there. Gripping the stone above the waterline, soaking up the mist that rolled off the sea every morning. That resilience is part of its identity. A plant that can survive salt spray, rocky soil, and months of Mediterranean drought develops a kind of toughness that you can actually smell. That sharp, almost aggressive scent is the plant's chemistry working overtime to survive conditions that would kill most herbs in a week. The Romans noticed this. They called the plant rosmarinum, which came from the Latin rosmaris, meaning dew of the sea. The name stuck because it described exactly where the plant lived and how it survived, drinking fog off the ocean, like it was the only water source it would ever need. And it is one of the most poetic plant names in any language, which matters because the poetry around this herb runs almost as deep as the science. References to rosemary show up in cuneiform tablets dating to the 5th millennium BCE, which makes it one of the oldest documented plants in human history. But the earliest civilizations that left detailed records of how they used it were not using it for food. They were using it for death. In ancient Egypt, rosemary belonged to the dead. Archaeologists have opened tombs more than 3,000 years old and found dried rosemary branches laid across the bodies inside. Some of those sprigs, sealed in the dark for 30 centuries, still carried a faint trace of the herb's scent when the tombs were first unsealed. The Egyptians placed rosemary in the hands of their dead because they believed the smell would guide the departed into the afterlife. It showed up in funeral bouquets, in embalming preparations, and in the ritual offerings left alongside food, jewelry, and tools meant for the next world. And this was not some minor detail of the burial process. Egyptian funerary practices were among the most elaborate and carefully structured rituals in the ancient world. Every item placed in a tomb had a specific purpose. Every object carried weight. Embalmers spent weeks preparing a body for the afterlife, and the materials they chose were selected with extraordinary care. The decision to include rosemary alongside gold, lapis lazuli, and carved amulets tells you exactly where this herb sat in the Egyptian hierarchy of things that mattered. It was not decoration, it was technology. The Egyptians genuinely believed it would function as a guide for the soul, something to help the dead navigate what came next. Think about that for a second. 3,000 years before anyone thought to put rosemary on a lamb chop, people were putting it in coffins. The herb you probably have in your kitchen right now was once considered important enough to carry a soul into eternity. And Egypt was only the beginning, because about 500 miles north, on the other side of the Mediterranean, the Greeks were doing something completely different with the same plant. In ancient Greece, rosemary was sacred to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. According to one myth, rosemary was draped over Aphrodite's body when she rose from the sea, and the herb carried her association with love and beauty from that point forward. The Greeks burned rosemary as an offering in their temples, used it to purify sacred spaces, and placed it on altars as a gesture of remembrance and devotion. But the Greeks also noticed something about rosemary that had nothing to do with the gods. They noticed it seemed to sharpen the mind. Greek students preparing for exams would braid sprigs of rosemary into crowns and wear them while they studied. The idea was that the herb's fragrance would strengthen their memory and help them recall what they had learned. This was not a fringe practice or some isolated folk belief. It was widespread enough that Theophrastus, the student and successor of Aristotle, wrote about the plant in his Historia Plantarum in the 4th century BCE. That text is one of the earliest formal botanical works in Western history, and rosemary is right there in its pages, treated with the same rigor as any other plant worth documenting. And it was not just students who took rosemary seriously. The physicians did too. Hippocrates, the Greek physician, often called the father of medicine, used rosemary in ointments to treat joint pain. He would macerate rosemary flowers and leaves in olive oil and apply the mixture to swollen, aching joints. A few centuries later, the physician Pedanius Dioscorides included rosemary in his 5-volume encyclopedia of herbal medicine, De Materia Medica, written in the 1st century CE. Dioscorides was a contemporary of both Pliny the Elder and Galen, and his encyclopedia became the gold standard reference on medicinal herbs for the next 1400 years. He wrote that rosemary was warming, that it cured jaundice, and that it could be mixed with remedies for the removal of fatigue. He also prescribed it as an energizer for athletes, which means that the idea of rosemary as a performance enhancer has been around for about 2,000 years longer than most people realize. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. Because the answer is that for most of human history, the line between food, medicine, and religion was basically invisible. Now, pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that comes later. While the Greeks were weaving rosemary into crowns and grinding it into ointments, the Romans were doing something more practical with it. They were burning it as a cheap substitute for frankincense. Frankincense came from the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, the region that is now Yemen. It traveled overland and by sea through a punishing trade route that made the price astronomical. Only the wealthiest temples and households could afford to burn it regularly. But rosemary, which grew wild all over Italy and the broader Mediterranean, smelled close enough that even Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist, remarked on the similarity. The Greeks actually used the same word, libanotis, for both rosemary and frankincense, which tells you just how interchangeable the two were considered in ritual settings. Romans who could not afford frankincense burned rosemary instead, and the temples still smelled sacred. For everyday Romans, rosemary was the affordable incense, the one that let you participate in the rituals without emptying your savings. Pliny also wrote that rosemary was good for the stomach, and that its roots could treat wounds. He recommended the seed for chest pain, gout, and other ailments. He even described how it should be planted, noting that it preferred thin, crumbly soil and spots exposed to falling dew. For a naturalist cataloging the entire known world, Pliny gave rosemary a surprising amount of page space. We know from surviving fragments of Roman cookbooks that rosemary was used to season wine in medicinal recipes. Apicius, the most famous Roman cookbook author, may not have left us a complete rosemary recipe in the fragments that survived, but archaeologists found something better. At the Villa dei Papyri in Herculaneum, the Roman city buried by Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, researchers discovered remnants of rosemary alongside other common garden herbs. The plant was growing in a Roman garden right up until the second the volcano froze everything in ash. That kind of evidence does not lie. Rosemary was not exotic in Roman life. It was ordinary. It was right outside the back door. The Romans also wove rosemary into their wedding garlands and placed it on their dead, the same duality the Egyptians had practiced centuries earlier. A bride might carry rosemary to ensure faithfulness. A mourner would toss it into a grave to honor the memory of the person they had lost. Robert Herrick, the 17th century English poet, later captured this duality when he wrote about rosemary being grown for two ends, whether for a wedding or a burial. And this is the detail that quietly explains the next 500 years. The Romans carried rosemary with them as they expanded their empire. They brought it to Britain, They brought it across Gaul, they brought it into every territory their legions occupied, and everywhere the legions marched, rosemary took root. By the time the Roman Empire collapsed, the herb was already woven into the soil and the culture of half a continent. It did not need Rome to survive. It had already spread too far to disappear. What happened next would turn rosemary from a sacred plant into a weapon against the deadliest disease in human history. And it would give us one of the wildest stories in the entire history of medicine. In the Middle Ages, rosemary was everywhere in Europe. People scattered it on the floors of their homes and churches, especially at Christmas, so that when they walked on it, the fragrance would fill the room. The belief was that anyone who smelled rosemary on Christmas Eve would enjoy a full year of health and happiness. There was even a folk saying that traveled across medieval Europe. Where rosemary grows, the woman rules. It was popular enough to become a proverb, and some husbands reportedly tore out rosemary bushes from their gardens to avoid the gossip. But the story that changed rosemary's reputation forever started in Hungary, around the year 1370. Queen Elizabeth of Hungary was 72 years old and suffering from severe rheumatism and gout. According to the legend, a hermit presented her with a formula. He claimed it would preserve her beauty and health until the end of her life. The formula was simple at its core. Rosemary flowers distilled in high-proof brandy. That was the base. The result became known as Hungary water, and it is widely considered Europe's first documented alcohol-based perfume. The invention of the serpentine cooler in Italy around 1320 had made the production of high-proof alcohol possible for the first time, giving the herbal fragrance real staying power. Hungary water was the first major product of that technology. The legend gets wilder from there. The story goes that Hungary water reversed the Queen's aging so dramatically that the 25-year-old Grand Duke of Lithuania proposed marriage to her when she was in her 70s. Whether that detail is true or embellished beyond recognition is anyone's guess. But Hungary water itself was real. It spread to the court of Charles V of France in the 1370s. It was supposedly written down by the Queen herself in golden letters, and that manuscript is said to reside in the Imperial Library in Vienna. By the 16th century, modified versions of Hungary water appeared in medical books across Europe. The Swiss physician Paracelsus created his own version and recommended it specifically for protection against contagion. Queen Elizabeth I of England reportedly ordered barrels of Hungary water during London's plague outbreak of 1563, distributing it to her courtiers and instructing them to apply it liberally several times a day. And this is where Rosemary's story collides head-on with the Black Death. The bubonic plague tore through Europe in devastating waves across several centuries, killing tens of millions of people. In a world without antibiotics, without germ theory, without any real understanding of how disease spread, people reached for whatever they could find. Rosemary was one of the herbs they reached for most. They burned it in sick rooms to purify the air. They stuffed it into the beak-shaped masks that plague doctors wore when they visited the dying. They hung bundles of it in doorways and rubbed it on their skin, hoping that the sharp smell might keep the sickness at bay. And then there were the thieves. The legend of 4 thieves vinegar is one of the strangest stories in the history of medicine. The details shift depending on who tells it, but the core stays the same. During a plague outbreak in Marseille, a group of thieves were caught robbing the homes and bodies of plague victims. They had been looting the dead for weeks, sometimes months, moving through houses and graveyards where the plague was killing everyone it touched. And somehow, none of the thieves had gotten sick. When they were arrested, the authorities offered them a deal. Share the recipe that kept you alive, and we will spare your lives. One version of the story says the thieves were actually spice merchants and sailors, put out of work when the plague shut down the ports, who had turned to grave robbing out of desperation. Another version says they were already convicted criminals whose punishment was burying plague victims, and they created the vinegar to survive the sentence. Either way, they revealed that they had been dousing themselves in a vinegar infused with herbs. Rosemary was one of the key ingredients, along with sage, wormwood, lavender, garlic, and camphor. The recipe was reportedly posted on the walls of Marseille so that everyone could make it. And no, I'm not making that up. A version of the recipe hung in the Museum of Paris as late as 1937, and it is said to be an original copy of the one posted during the outbreaks. The recipe called for 3 pints of strong white wine vinegar, a handful each of wormwood, meadowsweet, wild marjoram, and sage, 50 cloves, 2 ounces of angelica, rosemary, and horehound, and 3 large measures of camphor. Place the mixture in a container for 15 days. Strain and bottle. Use by rubbing it on the hands, ears, and temples when approaching a plague victim. The kind of number that makes accountants cry. Except these were not accountants. These were people trying not to die. Modern chemical analysis actually explains why some of this worked. The alcohol concentration in preparations like Hungary water was strong enough to damage bacterial cell membranes. Rosemary itself contains compounds called carnosic acid and rosmarinic acid, both of which have demonstrated antimicrobial properties in laboratory studies. And here is the detail that ties it all together. The common flea, which carried the plague bacterium Yersinia pestis, is repelled by the strong aromatic oils in herbs like rosemary, thyme, and lavender. The vinegar itself is a natural insecticide. The thieves may not have understood the science, but the science was there beneath every ingredient in the recipe. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. While plague doctors were stuffing rosemary into their masks across the cities of Europe, a playwright in London was about to make the herb immortal in a completely different way. William Shakespeare used rosemary in 2 of his most famous plays, and the way he used it tells you how deeply the herb was already embedded in English culture. In Hamlet, written between 1599 and 1601, the character Ophelia distributes flowers and herbs to the members of the royal court during her descent into madness after her father's murder. She hands rosemary to her brother Laertes and tells him it is for remembrance, and asks him to please love and remember. The moment is devastating because Ophelia is about to die. The rosemary is not just a symbol of memory, it is a farewell. She is handing her brother something to remember her by, knowing that she will not be alive much longer to be remembered in person. Every flower Ophelia gives in that scene carries a meaning. Pansies for thoughts, fennel for flattery, rue for regret. But rosemary comes first because remembrance is the thing she wants most. Shakespeare used the herb again in Romeo and Juliet, where Friar Lawrence instructs mourners to place rosemary on Juliet's body for her burial. The herb that the Egyptians placed in the hands of their dead 3,000 years earlier was still being placed on the dead in Shakespeare's London, in the same gesture for the same reason. And Shakespeare did not invent this association, he cemented it. By the time he wrote those scenes, rosemary was already a fixture at English weddings and English funerals. People spread it on church floors at Christmas. Brides gave grooms sprigs of rosemary to ensure faithfulness. Mourners carried it in funeral processions and tossed it into open graves. At the most elegant medieval weddings, rosemary sprigs were dipped in gold and tied with ribbon, a gesture to say that although the couple was starting a new life, they would always remember their family and friends. Rosemary also served a practical purpose. Its sturdy stems, when grown on arbors and walls, were sometimes even used to make lutes. It was everywhere, in almost every room, for almost every occasion. Shakespeare turned a folk tradition into literature, and the literature turned it into something permanent. 400 years later, people still reach for that line from Hamlet when they want to talk about memory. But here is the part of the story where the ancient world catches up with the modern one. For thousands of years, people claimed rosemary improved memory. Greek students wore it on their heads during exams. The name Herb of Remembrance followed rosemary across continents and centuries. And for most of that time, there was no real way to test whether any of it was true. It was folklore. It was tradition. It was the kind of thing people repeated because their grandmothers repeated it, and their grandmothers before them. Then, in 2012, a team at Northumbria University in the United Kingdom decided to find out. Mark Moss and Lorraine Oliver, researchers from the Brain, Performance and Nutrition Center at Northumbria, designed a study around a chemical compound called 1,8-cineol, which is one of the primary components of rosemary essential oil. They brought in 20 healthy volunteers and had them perform cognitive tasks inside a small room that had been diffused with the scent of rosemary. The tasks included serial subtractions and visual information processing, the kind of work that requires sustained focus and recall. After the tasks were completed, mood assessments were taken, and the researchers drew blood samples from each participant. What they found was startling. The participants who had been breathing rosemary aroma had measurable levels of 1,8-cineol in their bloodstreams. The compound had crossed from the air, through their lungs, and into their blood. And the higher the concentration of 1,8-cineol in a person's plasma, the better they performed on the cognitive tests. Both speed and accuracy improved, which meant it was not a trade-off where you got faster, but sloppier. The improvement was across the board. The study was published in the journal Therapeutic Advances in Psychopharmacology, and the researchers concluded that compounds absorbed from rosemary aroma affect cognition and subjective state independently through different neurochemical pathways. 1,8-cineol appeared to keep a neurotransmitter associated with memory in better working order. That was not the end of it. Moss ran a follow-up study, this one on 66 adults, and presented the results in 2013 at the annual conference of the British Psychological Society in Harrogate, United Kingdom. This time, the focus was on prospective memory, which is the ability to remember events that will happen in the future and to remember to complete tasks at specific times. Participants entered one of two rooms. One room had been diffused with rosemary essential oil. The other had no scent at all. The participants who had been in the rosemary room performed significantly better on the prospective memory tasks. Blood analysis confirmed that those in the rosemary room had significantly higher levels of 1,8-cineol in their plasma, and the researchers concluded that the influence of the aroma was mediated pharmacologically, not just through mood or alertness. Then, Moss tested children. 40 students aged 10 to 11 sat in either a rosemary-scented classroom or a control room and completed a series of memory tests. The children who inhaled rosemary scored significantly higher than those who did not. Greek students wearing rosemary crowns during exams in the 4th century BCE. British schoolchildren scoring higher on memory tests in a rosemary-scented classroom in the 21st century, 2,400 years apart. Same plant, same result. And the story does not end in a laboratory. It ends on a peninsula in Turkey. Rosemary grows wild on the Gallipoli Peninsula, the narrow strip of land where Australian and New Zealand troops landed on April 25, 1915, and fought one of the bloodiest campaigns of the First World War. More than 50,000 Australians served there, and more than 8,700 of them never came home. The soldiers who survived walked through wild rosemary every day on those rocky Mediterranean slopes, crushing the leaves under their boots, breathing in that sharp, the familiar scent above the sea on the same kind of terrain where the plant had grown since before the Egyptians built their first tombs. After the war, a wounded Australian soldier brought a small rosemary cutting home from ANZAC Cove. He planted it in the grounds of the Keswick Military Hospital in Dore Park, South Australia. In the 1980s, a gardener at the hospital recalled the history of the plant and told David Laurie about its origins. Cuttings from that original bush were propagated and sent to nurseries across the country, supporting avenues of honour and memorial gardens from coast to coast. Today, Australians and New Zealanders wear sprigs of rosemary on their lapels every ANZAC Day, April 25th, to remember the soldiers who fought and died at Gallipoli and in every conflict since. The sprigs are handed out by Legacy and the RSL, and they are pinned to medals, coats, and the chests of people who never saw combat but understand why remembering matters. The same herb the Egyptians placed in tombs to guide the dead 3,000 years ago. The same herb Greek students wore on their heads to pass their exams. The same herb Shakespeare gave to Ophelia so she could say goodbye to her brother. The same herb plague doctors stuffed into their masks while walking through streets full of the dying. Now pinned to the chest of an Australian standing at a dawn service in the cold morning light, remembering people they never met who died on a peninsula where the rosemary still grows wild. You probably used rosemary this week. You shook it out of a jar. Or maybe you walked past a bush and caught the scent without breaking stride. Except now, you know what you were holding. 5,000 years of memory, medicine, death, beauty, war, and science, packed into a single woody stem that grows on sea cliffs and refuses to die. The real question is not why the ancients treated this herb as sacred. The real question is when we stopped noticing what was already in our hands.